One of the great things about being part of a community of sculptors of all levels, students who just started sculpting and third-year students who are very good, graduates in residence who are of course great at sculpting, that's why they got awarded graduate in residence, and teachers with decades of experience from multiple industries, some of whom worked on Star Wars and The Hobbit, some who worked on monuments, and some who carved in stone. All sorts of level of experience from all over the world, with a multitude of different outlooks on life. The greatest thing about being part of such a community is the sharing that takes place, and in that sharing, support. It's almost funny to me how so many people from so many places and backgrounds have the very same doubts when it comes to art. This extends beyond us all as well, of course, and back in time. You can find a lot of artists throughout history who face the same doubts that we face today. People like Michelangelo write about these things. And if he has doubts, then I think it's okay for us to have some as well. So recently I spoke to a friend and former student who expressed concerns or doubts about the validity of a long project that he was embarking upon or was working on. He asked me if I ever feel like a project is a mistake, like he's wasting his time essentially, and that you're making something stupid or something silly. Now, I'm not so surprised that he asked me this, because any project that drags on over a long period of time is really bound to harbor doubts. What constitutes a long project depends on the person, of course. For some, a long project might be something that stretches over a week, and for some, it's going to be years. Patience is a muscle that can and probably should be exercised. So I answered this question by saying, of course. Doubts are part of the game. You have to override that part of your brain while working and focus on the work and the objectives. Essentially be goal-oriented, and don't let the feeling of the day dictate decisions too much. I've heard some artists, usually painters, because painters usually have the opportunity to work a little bit faster than us sculptors, speak about how when a project no longer keeps your interest or motivation, then it's time to quit on it. Then it's time to just move on and start something new. And as a sculptor, you don't have this luxury, in my opinion. A sculpture takes a long time to make, and you can't quit because your motivation runs out. And you also can't stop because the clay is going to dry. Motivation comes as a product of work, and not the other way around, I believe. So you do the work, and you'll be motivated. There are days when there is mostly self-doubt and not so much motivation to be found, perhaps, and those are the days when having objectives and goals, questions to ask about your work that deals with the objective reality and not how you feel about your work. Those are the days when it's important to have those in order to keep you going. I don't want to remove emotions or feelings from the equations either. You have to listen to your gut feelings, but try not to let those make decisions for you on a whim. Sculptors are the marathon runners of the art world, and I'm sure that if I tried to run a marathon, which I haven't done, so who knows, but I'm sure that if I tried to, I would consider the whole thing a bad idea halfway through, or probably multiple times through the marathon. So doubts are inherent to this kind of work, I think. If you have them, you're not alone. I've met artists at all sorts of levels who have worked on all sorts of things, and they all exhibit a certain amount of doubt about their own work, no matter how good they end up getting, and no matter how tough they perhaps seem on the outside. Once you go into their studio and you ask them about their work, all of a sudden, a lot of doubts surface. Ideally, a process can exercise some of those doubts, or at least alleviate them. But doubt will always be there, and so, as a sculptor, it's important to be comfortable with that and learn how to live with it and function with it. So my doubts about this project, they came and went as this thing dragged on for 2.5 years. There's a lot of doubt when working on something for that amount of time. Doubts come and go. So for me, it helped a lot to, whenever I had a doubt, make a plan to solve the issue that I had doubts about. I would try to identify the issue, the reason why I had doubts, and then observe the work for a long period of time in multiple formats, meaning I would look at the piece, of course, and I would take photos and look at those at home, and I would write down a plan. Every day I worked on the piece, almost every day I worked on the piece, I would make a new plan in my notebook, and I would try to accomplish a set of goals. Doubts like, am I doing the right kind of project? Those I try to ignore, because when you are a year into something, those doubts, those should be meaningless, I think. You've decided on making something and now you make it. And at some point, certain doubts need to be left behind and ignored. Having a clear and set list of goals to accomplish meant that every day was progress, even if it was very small. I didn't show up in the morning with no plan and try to come up with things to do, essentially. Sometimes I did do that, but more often than not, I made a plan the previous day or the night before so that when I showed up in the morning, I knew what needed to take place and I knew what I was supposed to do. Having a plan of progress means that the work does progress at a certain pace. You don't get stuck. And having no plan means that it's sort of up to chance what happens. And I don't like leaving the success of my work up to chance. I'd like it to be on me, not the universe, essentially. So when I teach and when I give feedback and critiques, I'll ask students what is their plan for the day. And you'll be surprised to hear, perhaps, that more often than not, they won't have one. I think it's important, or it can at least be really helpful, to have a written down plan, one that is not so grand that it can't be accomplished in a day. So instead of saying, finishing the legs, perhaps the plan will say, continue to improve the contours of the legs, or perhaps redraw the internal information on the legs. Specific instructions like that are going to lend itself to progress, and also to feeling, at the end of the day, like you accomplished something. And working without the feeling of progress is very tough on the mind. So having some way to track the progress can be very helpful. A big problem with working on larger scale pieces, even something that's just life-size, let alone over life-size like I'm doing here, is that the progress is slow and the work can look really bad or like nothing for a very long time. This is where having really good and clear goals come into play. Understanding what needs to happen when and how the piece is going to progress really helps, and that's of course very hard to do without having done it many times before. I remember, for example, when working on my life-size sculpture during my final term at the academy, telling one of my instructors, Sane, that I didn't really think that this project was going so well. I was really worried. I was like, this thing looks really bad. I don't know what's going on. I think it was perhaps week 2 or 3 when I expressed these concerns to her. Now, she didn't really tell me anything to calm my mind. She didn't say, oh, it's going really well, don't worry. She just pointed out some issues here and there, which I'm sure there was plenty more of, and she let me work. So then later in the project, perhaps week 6 out of 10, she asked me again if my feelings about my work had changed, if I sort of liked it now. And of course it had, since now the groundwork had been laid early on and it was starting to pay off. The sculpture was starting to look like something. And I'm not sure if she meant this as some sort of lesson for me, but For me, it was a lesson in trust, and that the look of something doesn't always mean anything in regards to its success. That's where goals and objectives come into play. So those lessons I took with me into this project, and here such lessons are of course multiplied tenfold. Here things take an extraordinary amount of time to become anything, and the setup is everything. Knowing that by sticking to my process means it will turn out in the end, is really calming, soothing, and helpful. In the beginning of your journey, while you're getting educated, this requires trust in your instructors. Later, when you're on your own, it requires trust in yourself.